This video explores the impacts that your family, culture and society have on your thinking and behaviour, and the danger of confusing normal behaviour with natural behaviour. Imagine that you're asked to program a robot to replace you, or a robot that would be identical to you. I'm going to call this a digital doppelganger. Imagine that you had to program this digital doppelganger with all the thoughts, beliefs, values, inflections, tics, habits, nervous habits that you had, so that your robot, this doppelganger, would be completely indistinguishable from you. What is it that you would need to program into the machine? What is it that it would need to know? Let's explore that. The great debate that's been going on for years, and seems to still be going on to some extent, is how much of who we are is our nurture and how much is our nature? How much have we been taught to be how we are and how much is just our genetics? Here on the screen on the left hand side is the blank slate. There are people that believe that 100% of who we are is learnt, is something that has been instilled upon us since birth. Tabula rasa is the term, the blank slate, where we're born knowing absolutely nothing, with no predisposition for any particular behaviour or thought, and everything that we are and that we become is something we've learnt. The other extreme is on the right hand side, and that's some stylised vial of DNA strands by the looks of things, and that's to say that nature takes care of our behaviour, that what we are is a reflection of our genetics. There's no denying the impact of genetics, and here we've got a father and the two twins, and you can see that the two twins are visually very similar and they look very much like their dads. So you can't deny the impact of genetics. And one of the ways they try to decide how much is of our personality and our behaviour is nature and how much is nurture is through twin studies. And specifically, well, there's a number of twin studies they do, and obviously looking at twins that are born and raised together tells you a certain amount, but some interesting research is twins separated at birth. There's a story that Steven Pinker talks about, and I'll talk about Steven in a second, and his favourite example is a pair of twins that were separated at birth, and one was brought up Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany. So this must be a few years ago. So one twin was brought up Catholic in Germany in a Nazi family, and the other was brought up in a Jewish family in Trinidad. How is that for two completely different environments? And they came in to Steven Pinker's laboratory, and when they walked into the lab, he found that they were wearing identical shirts. They were both wearing blue shirts with epaulets. They both liked to dip buttered toast into coffee. They both kept rubber bands around their wrists. They both flushed the toilets before and after using them. And they both liked to sneeze in crowded elevators to surprise people and watch them jump. So here is some fairly eclectic behaviour which is common across these two twins that have been brought up in very, very, very different environments. And whilst that's really interesting, what is more important is that we do know that environment has a massive impact on who we are and how we behave. I'll give you an example of this, and the example I'm going to give you is me. So let's talk a little bit about my background. My parents were both born in Malta, and one was born in 1924, the other one was born in 1925. And so as teenagers, they were subject to World War II. And Malta in World War II was the most bombed place on the planet at that time. There would be, at its worst, there would be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 air raids per day. Per day. There could be 9 different air raids per day. And as teenagers, Mum and Dad would live through this. Mum tell stories about the fact that when she was a girl and she would hear the air raid siren, they didn't go down to the air raid shelters, and that's a whole other story. They didn't go down to the air raid shelters. At night, what they would do is they go up into the roof of the house and watch the planes, the Germans in this case, dropping bombs on the city around them, which is fairly phenomenal. So that must have had a fairly interesting impact on their young lives. But they ended up surviving quite happily, and then they got married and came to Australia. So here's Mum and Dad. There's Mum and Dad, early 20s, I guess, maybe mid-20s. Now, I find the picture of Dad, I find really, really interesting. He's a dapper man. He's dressed really well. He looks quite swished there, and he's little cardi and his tie, and looks very distinguished. Now, the interesting thing about Dad is he couldn't read or write. He was completely illiterate. So here is a man that is completely illiterate and yet could still present as a very distinguished sort of young man, presented very well, in my opinion, anyway. But remember that these people, just a handful of years ago, were sifting through rubble, as teenagers were sifting through rubble, wondering whether they were going to survive the night or not. And they came to Australia, and Australia was slightly different. In 1952, which is when they came to Australia, well, this is the sort of thing they saw. This is Miss Bondi Beach. These are the Miss Bondi Beach finalists in 1952. 2 or 3 years before they came to Australia, they were sifting through rubble, and then they come to Australia, and this is the sort of lifestyle they see. And then suddenly I grow up, and I get born, and I grow up in the 1960s and the 1970s, and there's me on my little red bike. Not too sure how old I am there, 8, 9, 10, something like that. I was a bit scrawny back in those days. The impact of that history is reflected in me, and I've grown up to be, I guess, an Aussie male. So here's me, a caricature of me, out in the backyard, at the barbecue, a typical Aussie male, beer in one hand, barbecue tongs in the other. But you know, that was a sheer accident of birth. I could have been born in Malta. I could have been born in Canada. I could have been born in all sorts of places. There's another type of typical Aussie male that I could have been, but ended up not being, and that's this type of Aussie male. Now, here's a typical Aussie male. We don't normally call them a typical Aussie male, but here is an Indigenous Australian. And had I been born as an Indigenous Australian, my life would have been completely different. My values would have been different. I mean, my food would have been different. My lifestyle would have been different. I would have been a very, very different person. Genetically, I could be identical, but I'd be a very, very different person purely because of the environment I was brought up in. Now, my mum's grandmother was Italian. So there's historically, I have a genealogy that goes back to Italy and Rome. So it could be that had I been born 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that this might have been me. Of course, I'm pretending here that I was born to a high family, so I'm a senator in Rome here, but I would have needed to have been born into the right family to become a senator in Rome. If I'd been born to a lowbrow family, I would have probably been a soldier rather than a senator. Either way, I would have ended up in the military, most likely, depending on what era in Rome, what time I was born. But again, genetically, I could be exactly the same sort of person. So I might have always been interested in philosophy and high-performance thinking. I might have always been interested in training and communication, but my life would have been very different. What about if I was born in a completely different culture? What if I happened to be born Asian? How different would my life have been? My whole philosophy would have been different. The Asian cultures tend to be more collectivist, with the European and certainly the Australian cultures are more individualistic. But the underlying philosophy of life, how you behave, is very much handed to you from your culture. And of course, who knows how I'm going to behave in the future? And if I happen to be born in the future, well, who knows? Who knows how I'll be? Now, the interesting thing is that these influences, these cultural influences, they're very subtle and they're very persistent and they're very, very biased. And I'd like to have you consider this next question. Have a look at this picture. Have a look at this young child. And the question is, why is this baby crying? So just for 1 second, think about why you think this young person is crying. They did some research a few years ago and they asked a very similar question. They got a group of people and they showed them a picture similar to this. And they said, why is this baby crying? Now, the interesting thing is that when they did the research, they actually asked, why is this girl baby crying or why is this boy baby crying? They actually indicated the gender of the child. And it was the same picture. So this young person in front of you now could be male or female. It's very difficult to tell if that's a boy or a girl. Here's the interesting thing. When the respondents were asked, why is this girl baby crying? The answers tended to be because the baby has just been frightened. Something has scared the child. When the question was asked, why is this boy baby crying? And remember, it was the same picture. It was the same visual stimulus. The only difference was thinking whether it was a boy or a girl. When they were asked, why is this boy baby crying? The answer was because the baby was angry. Something has happened to make the child angry. So when a girl cries, we think she's scared. And when a boy cries, we think he's angry. And these are subtle social influences that come through in our language, in our thoughts, in our behaviour that we don't necessarily think about. From the moment a baby is born, it's constantly being reinforced about its gender and about cultural norms from the moment of birth. This young lad here, for a start, is dressed to resemble his dad. So he's got the cap on backwards and similar colourings, looks a bit like Dad. So instantly the clothes we put on children indicate to them what their genders are, what the cultural norms are. And again, this child is being encouraged to play soccer. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the child being encouraged to play soccer. The question would be would we treat a girl child exactly the same way? Would we give her as much encouragement or the same encouragement to be playing soccer, or would the parents be encouraging her to be playing something differently? So these subtle influences from society and from culture, from our parents, from our family, we're constantly being bombarded with them, and they impact us, and not just our gender, but depending on where we're born, our religion, our thoughts, our beliefs are all impacted by what we learn, by our nurture. So back to the slide. How much of who we are is nurture, and how much of who we are is nature? I'll give you two answers to that. Judith Rich Harris has written this book. It's a Pulitzer Prize. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, The Nurture Assumption. And her argument is that about 50% of who we are comes from our nature, and the other 50% comes from our nurture. So only about half of our behaviour, how we think, our personality, is in our genetics. The rest of it we learn. Dr. Steven Pinker, who I talked about earlier, now he's a Canadian-born US experimental psychologist. He's a cognitive scientist, a linguist and a popular author. He's a professor at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. His books, and he wrote a book called The Blank Slate, he says that towards the second segment there in the light blue, that about 40 to 50% of our personality is genetic, is hereditary. Only about 40 to 50%. Up the top in the pink colour there, roughly 50% of our personality, of who we are, of our behaviour, of our makeup, comes from unique environmental factors. In fact, there's social factors that influence us. And down the bottom, 10% are shared environmental factors. So the shared environmental factors shared with your siblings, what you're taught at home makes up about 0 to 10% of who you are. The environment that is shared with your siblings. Around about 40 to 50% are your genetics, and about 50% is the unique environmental factors, unique to you, so not shared with your siblings. So basically the impact of environment, society, culture, and your peer group. So at least half, up to about 60% of who you are as a person has been taught to you or impacted on you from your external environment. And that's the 60% that high performance thinking wants to work with. So here, try this quick quiz. What do the Australian Military College Duntroon and Toastmasters International have in common? And what they have in common is that they both have the same catchphrase, where leaders are made. Here, there's a recent video I saw. Here's the last slide in the video for a Duntroon, Royal Military College Duntroon, where leaders are made. And here is a Toastmasters badge. Again, you can see where leaders are made. Both Toastmasters and the Royal Military College believe that leadership is a skill to be learned, not a natural talent that we're born with. And this is true. That and this is what's important, is that we often think that many things that we think are natural talents, such as leadership, such as the ability to communicate, such as patience, such as tolerance, such as being able to exist in a loving relationship. We often think that these are things that are inborn in us, but that's not true. Many of what we consider to be natural talents are actually things that we have learned, or things that we can learn. You can learn to be a better leader. You can learn to be a better communicator. You can learn to be a better parent, or a better supervisor, or a happier person. These are things that you can learn to be. So it's easy to see that how society has an impact on us, and here I've taken some fairly eclectic, specific cultural influences. You know, Indigenous Australian, or ancient Rome, or Asian, or Australian Aussie, or from the future. It's easy to see that the impact that those societies would have on us. But what about the impact living in a particular city or suburb or street, or being born of a particular generation? How do those things impact who we are? They all impact on our behaviour, and they all impact on our normal behaviour. Normal behaviour is relative. So I'd like to explore that a second, and I'd like to explore the difference between normal behaviour and natural behaviour. Normal behaviour is defined as conforming to a standard, something that is usual, typical, or expected. Normal behaviour is behaviour that is culturally acceptable within the culture that you happen to be born in. So what's culturally acceptable in 21st century Sydney might be very different to what would have been culturally acceptable in 5th century Rome, for example. Mainstream behaviour. So if you look at, so normal behaviour is what most of the people, average behaviour, mainstream behaviour, the sort of behaviour that you would expect to be acceptable for most people as you walk down the street. So normal behaviour is mainstream behaviour. Typical behaviour, how would you typically, if you took a typical representative, in the courts they talk about the man on the street. Is this acceptable would the man on the street accept this as being reasonable? Typical behaviour, reasonable behaviour, the sort of average behaviour that a person of that particular culture would be expected to exhibit would be normal behaviour. The thing about normal behaviour is that it's a social construction. Normal behaviour is behaviour that has been constructed by the environment, by the culture around us. It would come under the nurture category, under the nurture-nature debate. Natural behaviour, definition, existing in or derived from nature, not made or caused by humankind. So natural behaviour would be universal behaviour, universally something that all humans on the planet would participate in. So, for example, laughing is natural behaviour. If you laugh at something that's funny, if you're happy and you see something funny and you laugh, that is natural behaviour. All human beings do that. Crying when something is sad is natural behaviour. Now, I know some people can suppress their tears and may have some trouble expressing their emotions, but sadness and crying when you're sad is a universal behaviour. Now, I'll tell you what's not a universal behaviour. Nodding for yes. Nodding your head up and down in agreement for yes is not natural universal behaviour. There are some cultures that use a different head movement to express yes. So, for example, a lot of people I know from India will waggle their head from side to side to mean yes, rather than nod it front to back. Umming and ahhing, I've been doing a little bit of umming and ahhing today. Umming and ahhing is not a natural behaviour. Different languages have different sounds that they make whilst they're thinking. So rather than going word, the Japanese, for example, will say eto. So their vocalization, their thinking sound, is a completely different sound. So umming and ahhing is not natural. And that's a really interesting thing to think about. So I would say that natural behaviour is behaviour that's driven evolutionarily. It comes through our genetics. It comes through evolution. We've learnt as a species to adapt and behave in certain ways, and it's in our genes. Or if you prefer, if you're not into evolution, the way God made us. The way God made us as opposed to what we've learnt to be. So natural behaviour is inborn behaviour. Normal behaviour is socially constructed. And the problem is people can't tell the difference. There's a process known as normalization. Normalization is a social process where ideas and actions seem to be not just normal, but natural. We feel that these behaviours are natural. The way we behave in our society seems to feel natural, but the truth is it's not. Normal behaviour is not natural behaviour. And it's important to understand that, and here's why. We feel so connected to our normal behaviours, and these are learned behaviours, that we feel threatened when people challenge them. We feel so threatened that when we challenge, we will fight and argue and hate and blame and rage and cry and dismiss and ridicule and punch and fear and abuse and spite and even kill to protect our set of values that are really just a representation of the mere accident of our birth. Life must be lived forwards, but it can only be understood backwards. This is where high-performance thinking comes in. See, a practitioner of high-performance thinking will periodically question and evaluate their layers of values, rules, beliefs and decisions, and actively seek out to replace out-of-date layers and replace them with more beneficial ones. Low performance thinkers will react to situations without question, and often simply just to validate their own position. High performance thinkers, on the other hand, will respond and adapt to situations, aiming for the best outcome. Now, at the end of most chapters in the ebook, there are a list of action exercises. I'll just quickly tell you what the action exercises are for this particular section. So this is about the accident of your birth. So the action exercises are to list 10 ways that you have similar thoughts or values to significant people in your childhood. So how are you the same as your parents, grandparents and guardians, etc.? And then list 3 ways that you have different thoughts or values from the significant people in your childhood. And have a think about that. Reflect on why those differences exist. Why is it that you think differently to the significant people around you? Now, imagine that you had been born into a different family in a different part of the world. So you're born into a completely different culture. How different would your life be? Reflect on that for a few minutes. And then take 5 minutes to ponder the quotes that started off this particular section. Destiny is not a matter of chance. It's a matter of choice. It's not a thing to be waited for. It's a thing to be achieved. The next video introduces learning, memory, and how the brain works. We also look at the structure of your thoughts and how they influence your behaviour.